Great. So, welcome back everyone. I hope my voice is audible at the back. Perfect. Great. So, over the last couple of days, you would have heard a few recurring themes. So, just to list them out, so you would have heard about the cloud, how important it is, and then we moved on to GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, and then today we also looked at Brexit and the topic around it. Now, these are three topics which in my opinion are something that is going to consume most of your time over the next year or two. And just the way you cannot escape from having to deal with GDPR and Brexit, you also cannot escape from the fact that you'll also need to deal with the cloud. Because as we'll see later, and some interesting statistics, so that's something that you cannot escape from. Okay. So let's take a look at some typical issues that people in the information security space today. So if I'm a chief information security officer, then it's entirely possible that my enterprise IT is already on the cloud or planning to get into the cloud in some aspect or the other. Now the biggest issue then that I have is if I'm a chief information security officer, I simply don't own my enterprise IT because it's out there somewhere. I have no control or no ownership, no responsibility over it today. Or let's say if I'm a chief privacy officer, then I'm going to have lots of sleepless nights worrying about where my personally identifiable information, where electronic health records, or let's say even payment card records. So if let's say they're in a cloud environment, then are they crossing certain boundaries? Is somebody able to get to the data? So that's going to be the chief of my worries. So an interesting statistic, so if you see majority of DLP violations that have been reported, so DLP stands for data loss protection, so it involved personally identifiable information at a whopping around 54%, then the electronic health information about 15%, and payment card industry data at about 10%. So that's a significant share, and that means any DLP violation that you see today primarily falls into one of these categories. And it's pretty simple to get into these problems because now let's say I need to convert a file. Suppose it's in a document format, I need to convert it into PDF. It's extremely easy for any of your employees to just go to any of the cloud services, upload the document, get it back in PDF format. But if the document had sensitive information, it's now completely owned by that cloud service provider who you have no control over. And then we have no idea whether the document is going in any other direction. So is the cloud provider going to delete that document? What's the proof that they've deleted the document? So there's no control over that. And moving forward, so again, so if I'm a chief risk officer and if I'm looking to move my enterprise IT to the cloud, then there comes the issue that do we even understand what the risk scenarios are from a cloud perspective? Because as long as everything is within my enterprise, I know that I can model the risk scenarios because I completely know my business operating and technology environments. But when something is away from my boundary, do we even understand what the threat landscape is out there today? And is there any best practice or guidance that I can look to understand that? Or let's say if I'm slightly within the organization looking at business continuity, then am I even aware of what let's say dependencies are there between my cloud assets? Is any of my critical business processes supported by the cloud asset? Do we have this documented anywhere and so on? So from MetricStream's experience, we see that typically when you're looking at the cloud environment, most of our customers today, they're either at a very low level of maturity when you look at let's say compliance related to the cloud or even documenting information about the cloud. So another interesting statistic, especially with the European region. So you see that it says typically an European organization uses more than 1,000 cloud services, and that's seeing significant increase every year. So just from last year, it's a 33% increase, and that's a pretty significant number. And if you look at the next statistic, it typically takes an enterprise IT security group about 18 days to just evaluate the security of a new cloud provider. Now, the number of cloud services is growing exponentially, and it's simply impossible for enterprise IT to have any of these covered because let's say even if I put few firewall rules in place, then there's always a new service that's going to come through the door, which your employees know about, and they're going to use it. And that becomes let's say, a backdoor for sensitive information to flow out of the company. So having said this, in summary, these are the key problems that we have seen our customers face today. So essentially, poor visibility into cloud assets and services, and what business purpose each asset is being used for. Now, sometimes you see that, let's take the example of Uber itself, right? So they're completely cloud-based operations. So they don't have any on-premise assets and so on. But then do they actually know which asset on the cloud is storing what information? Is it tagged? So do I know that a particular server is storing all of my customer card information, account information, personal identifiable information? So typically they do not. And you also do not typically have a governance model to protect your enterprise IP. So that's a key problem that we see today. And then again, the lack of business ownership and business accountability of cloud assets and cloud services. Again, a key problem, because where do you pin the blame? Now suppose I have, say, 500 virtual machines that my business has out there in the cloud. Where does the buck finally stop? So who's responsible for it? And then, as I said earlier, poor understanding of the threat landscape. So suppose I'm hosted with AWS, or I'm hosted with Google or somewhere else. Now, do I understand what these cloud providers are exposed to, what risks they're exposed to? And that means my business is automatically exposed to those risks as well. And then another interesting point that we saw in one of the earlier sessions today around cloud security is companies typically do not have required expertise on the best practices that are required for cloud governance, because there's a scarcity of skill set, scarcity of knowledge, and so on. And when you look at some of the other leading industry reports, you see that some of the key challenges go back again to what we just covered: security, compliance, lack of governance and control, as well as lack of resources and expertise. So when you look at all of these reports from different sources, that common theme emerges that security, compliance, governance, expertise is a key problem when you look at the cloud. And as you can see here, the number of VMs or servers or other critical assets that businesses put out on the cloud is also going to increase, and there's nothing that can be done to stop that. That's simply a fact of life. So again, even if I were to break down maturity-wise, let's say enterprises who have just looked at the cloud, they just started with the cloud, people who have some familiarity with the cloud, and other enterprises who are completely focused on the cloud. That means they have their whole operations running on the cloud. Again, a common theme emerges. You see that lack of resources and expertise, security, compliance is still a common problem, irrespective of where you are on that maturity curve. So all said, security, risk, and compliance for the cloud is a real problem, and it is real today. So it's something that you need to solve for today. So let's say even if you're looking at, let's say, moving to the cloud probably over the next year or so, something you need to think about today itself. Okay. And when you look at the growth market for cloud infrastructure, you see that this IDC report clearly calls out the fact that public cloud services are going to increase significantly. So by 2020, you see probably about, say, more than 30 to 40% of your infrastructure will be out on the cloud. Again, so cloud confidence is increasing. So 65% of IT leaders who are assessed and, let's say, who responded to the survey, and these were typical people in senior positions, chief privacy officers, chief information security officers, and so on. So they do believe that cloud is as secure or more secure than on-premise software. And when you go to Gartner predicts that by 2020, 95% of cloud security failures will be the customer's fault. Now, this is a key point that you need to look at, because that actually is shifting the accountability back to you. So although I may be using, say, 3 or 4 different cloud providers, if something were to happen to my customer data, it's not actually going to be the cloud provider's problem. The buck stops with me, and I'm going to be responsible for anything that happens on that front. Gartner also says that by 2020, everybody will be pretty much on the cloud, so there's no escaping that fact. So there's nothing that you can do because of all the other inherent advantages that cloud provides. So that brings us to 2 important terms, what I have here: accountable and unavoidable. So it's simply unavoidable that you cannot run away from the cloud. At the same time, when you do make that move, you will also be accountable for anything that happens on the cloud. So interestingly, we have one of our partners, BitSight, who you may have interacted with outside. They have a pretty comprehensive software that actually looks at vendors, not just cloud vendors, but pretty much any vendor you can think of, and they assign a security score for them. So examples here I have was for Box. Now typically most enterprises would be using Box for enterprise storage purposes, and you see that Box has a pretty good security rating. That's 800 out of a possible 900. Now what you also need to keep in mind is that this is not a point in time score, because obviously Box could also be subjected to a lot of security hacks and so on. And if, let's say, I had my enterprise storage out there on Box, and if, let's say, a month later Box was hacked and their security score were to come down drastically, say from 800 it shot down to 600, then that's of concern to me. And that means you actually have platforms such as BitSight, which can actually give you that intelligence for you to make real-time decisions on what needs to be done. So same thing with other vendors as well. So let's say if I'm using Stripe for card processing, today they have an excellent score of 790, but should a security hack or something were to happen on their servers, and these are all completely cloud-based providers, right? So you need to be aware of it. So that way, I'll also show how MetricStream can integrate with BitSight to bring you all the value add that you can look at from a cloud perspective. Now specifically talking about BitSight, you can see all the parameters that they look at when they evaluate a provider. So pretty comprehensive. So you're looking at botnet infections, spam propagation, malware, then how many exploits are there in the wild, domain records, certificates, open ports. So pretty much they're looking at the whole aspect of, I'll say, information security from a vendor perspective before they can assign a score. Now, this is pretty comprehensive because they're looking at each vendor from a 360-degree perspective and bringing you that critical information that you need to know. Okay, now that we have discussed the problems, now how do we actually take it forward and solve it? So what I mean by that is, how do you actually put a GRC framework or a governance risk and compliance framework for addressing all of these challenges? Now, getting back to the basics, what is GRC actually all about? So GRC, as OSIC says, is how do you reliably achieve business objectives or outcomes while dealing with uncertainty and acting with integrity. So that's the core premise of GRC, and that's applicable irrespective of whether you're dealing with the cloud or on-premise and so on. So the basic principles still hold good. And when I look at the critical capabilities for a GRC platform that needs to do cloud governance, risk and compliance, so what you need is a platform that can help you automate a lot of things, because when you look at the cloud, it's obviously elastic, and that means your infrastructure scales up, scales down based on business demand. So you need a platform that can actually handle that kind of a dynamic environment. So it should automate cloud security, risk and compliance workflows. And what I put here is that certain classifications, so you can look at a service and say whether it's denied, permitted, approved, or not yet classified by your enterprise. So that way I can look at, say, probably a new service that I'm planning to onboard. My IT can tell me whether it's already approved, denied, permitted, or unclassified. And a GRC platform can actually help your enterprise IT automate all of these workflows, so that suppose you submit a new request for a particular cloud service to be approved for access. So you get that complete automated workflows. And then you also need the platform to show you what are the best practices from a risk and controls perspective. Now there are multiple regulations and standards and frameworks out there that can help you with that, but the GRC platform needs to actually provide all of this for you in one place. So example could be the Cloud Security Alliance's treacherous top 12 threats, probably ISACA's cyber security threats and controls, the CIS critical security controls, some of the NIST controls, and so on. So the GRC platform becomes that one intelligent place where you can look at all of this content and understand best practices and guidance for your cloud adoption. And then the platform should also help you connect the dots across cloud security, risk and compliance. Again, these are not just point things that you do. So you don't do cloud security in its silo, cloud risk in its silo, cloud compliance in its silo. So you need the platform to actually connect the dots across all three. Now suppose I look at a cloud service or a cloud asset, I need to be able to do a risk assessment on that asset. I need to look at its security posture. I also need to make sure that whatever controls we have in place are effective on that particular service or asset. So here's another key point which also came up in today's expert panel on cloud security is do you actually know what is there on the cloud? So the platform should actually let you document all of your cloud assets, services, your business processes, dependencies across all of these. Do you have any policies in place for governance? So all of that should be enabled by the platform. And then the last point is ensuring stakeholder reporting and visibility, because you need to present a clear picture at multiple levels of your enterprise. So starting from the information security group to the CISO's office, to the chief privacy risk and compliance officer's office, right up to the board. So you need the platform to provide you with all of these reporting capabilities. Okay, so now that we have looked at how the GRC platform can actually help you address the problem, so I also know that you cannot start with all of these on day one, because that's going to be a big ask. So what instead I suggest is that you take this in small steps as you get on that GRC journey towards addressing all of the challenges on the cloud. Okay, so the first one is, to begin with, the core thing that you need to do is go and tag your cloud assets, because most of your cloud platforms do allow you to do that. So if you look at AWS or Google Cloud Compute and so on, they actually let you add tags to your assets, and that means you can give rich information about every asset that is provisioned. Is it a production instance, a non-production instance? Is it critical for my business, not critical for my business? Is it storing sensitive information or not? So you should be able to apply multiple levels of tagging from a business perspective to those assets. And that's a key difference, because you would obviously know what is the technology behind the asset, but do you know what's the business purpose of that asset? That's the point that I'm trying to make. So as an example, with AWS, you have a visual tag editor where you can select a group of assets belonging to a region and give it a tag. Okay, so the second one that you absolutely need to do is assign business ownership and accountability for your critical cloud assets. Now again, so like I said, where does the buck stop? So if a particular virtual machine were to be compromised, now who's going to be held accountable for it? So that's something that you need to take care of from day one. So assuming that, let's say you look at the MetricStream GRC platform, so we give you a quick way to do that. So you quickly get to document who is the owner and so on for each of those cloud assets. And then leveraging risk and control frameworks to assess cloud compliance, because you need to know what you need to do as a best practice or a guideline before you can actually go and address those challenges. And I did mention some of the standards that are there. So the platform can actually show you what the best practices are. So here's an example. So typical controls that you can have. And these are not just a fixed set, because you could always start with this and make them as granular as you like and applicable for your enterprise. And the final one, like I said, is ensuring security risk and compliance visibility to key stakeholders. So you need transparency across the board at various levels. And this is also a critical step that you need to take right from the start, because once you have all of the required reporting and notifications in place, you'll also be able to do continuous improvement on your GRC journey. So here's an example of a dashboard from the MetricStream platform. So in one place, it shows you all of the key information and insights that you can use for reporting. Okay, so that was what I wanted to cover. So I'm now open for questions. Cool. Thank you, everyone.